first I'm going to start out by sharing my screen and showing what the recipes are that we're going to make, and then a little bit of an order of this, and then we'll go from there. So this is the dough, the regular sort of commercial yeast dough for the pita bread, and that's what I've mixed already this morning. And then the main thing we're going to make is the pita bread, the pocket pita bread. All these recipes are from this cookbook called A Blessing of Bread. So anyway, this is the recipe for the pita itself, and you see we can either make 115 gram ones or 170. We're going to make the smaller one. And then for those who are interested, there's also this sourdough pita recipe, which you've got to start the night before or the day before. Now let me show you how to mix the dough. This dough is simpler than some to mix. We're basically going to put water, yeast, and some of the flour together to make what's called a slurry. We're going to let that sit for a few minutes, and then we're going to add the rest of the flour and let it mix up. And then that dough will let sit ideally for an hour and a half. Here is a bag of yeast that I traded this morning. I gave somebody sourdough and they left me this bag of yeast on the doorstep, so maybe we'll use that. In terms of measuring, there's two ways to do it, right? We can do it by the cups and teaspoons and all those English measures. I'm going to do it using the metric and using the scale, which was a revolution in baking when I realized you could that you could bake by weight, and that's better because you're getting a more accurate ratios of flour to water, but also it's just so much easier in terms of measurement and all that stuff. We're going to start out by getting water. One sec.
Warm water or cold water?
Warm water. So we are putting in here about 620 grams of water. And again, if you're measuring in grams, it doesn't have to be 100% accurate. Just think about it. It's 28 grams to an ounce, so a little bit here or there doesn't make much difference. That's our water. I'm going to mix the yeast in, which under this recipe is 5 grams of yeast, not very much, a teaspoon and a half, it says. Good enough. So then to that, we're going to add flour. So we want to add about 400 grams of the bread flour. So basically about 400 grams into this, and then adding another 600 once it has sat for a few minutes. So that scoop itself was about 200. I'm going to mix that up using a rubber spatula. All right, so there it's mixed up. You can sort of see in there. I don't know which one.
No, it's on the phone.
It is, okay. Yeah, so you can see in there, it's a little bit bubbly. I don't have every lump out of it, but that's what I got. Ideally, you want to let it sit for 15 minutes like this and then add the rest of the flour. So we put in like 400 grams of flour. We're going to add another 600. So I'm going to put 100 grams or so, maybe a little bit more of the wheat flour. It changes the color, it changes the taste. It's a little bit tastier. So I got 120 grams of the wheat flour there. And now I'm going to add the balance of the white flour, taking it up to 395 or something like that. The other thing I was supposed to do sooner, which of course I forgot, was to add the salt and the sugar. So why don't we get all this flour in? The reason to add that stuff first would be because we want to make sure that stuff mixes around in there. So a little under 600. Okay, and then we're going to want to add salt, sugar, and oil. For the salt, it is a tablespoon plus a teaspoon, or 20 grams is easier. 20 grams of salt. Let me try to move that. I'm going to put it in here. I'm going to try to make sure I mix it in as best I can when I do that. Sugar. It says the sugar is optional, but I think it's probably a good thing. Put 10 grams. And then finally oil, vegetable oil or olive oil. One thing about this is if you make pizza dough, and you have extra pizza dough, you can simply use the pizza dough and make your pita bread or whatever, all these other things with that same dough. It's virtually the same. And we're going to put 25 grams of oil. So I'm going to mix the dry ingredients in just to get them, the sugar and salt mixed in more. And then I'm going to add the oil. So in this case, I'm going to mix it with this spatula or rubber spoon for a while. And you want to kind of make sure you get the ingredients really in there pretty good. And then you've got two choices. If you have a KitchenAid mixer or some other kind of mixer that is strong enough to deal with bread, like Cuisinart, if you don't have too much dough, you can put it in there at this point. If you don't and you want to do it by hand, you would get your hands in there and start squishing it around and so on, and making it that way. So either one is fine. I'm going to use the mixer this time. I'm using the dough hook. I could have done that mixing I was just doing with the spoon, either maybe using the dough hook or using the paddle. A little more dough. All right, I'm going to run this so it'll make some noise. You can see as it's going, it's gradually picking up flour and other stuff from the side. Sometimes you're going to want to stop it, scrape stuff off the sides so that it all gets incorporated. So there was a question about all-purpose versus bread flour, I think, first. And maybe a question about wheat flour. So on all-purpose versus bread flour, I really think for this recipe, either one is fine. I mean, bread flour might be a little bit better because bread flour is a higher gluten flour. And so for things like pizza or bagels or stuff like this where you want it kind of chewy, it's better. But for pita bread especially, either one works. So one thing I notice people do a lot is they will put too much flour in their dough frequently. You'll see how I work it here on the table. I'll use some flour, but you got to be careful not to use too much. So if it's really wet and goopy sort of pancake batter, then that's going to be too much. But but otherwise, I wouldn't worry too much. But you know, there's times when you just sort of say, wait a minute, this is ridiculous, and you need to add, you do need to add some flour to it, and that's okay to do at the last minute. In terms of the wheat versus white flour, I mean, again, the key thing you want to deal with is the percentages of the ratio of water to flour. If that ratio is pretty much the same, you should be okay with wheat flour. If you're using a lot of wheat flour, you probably are going to want a little bit higher percentage of water for the same kind of dough. And again, if it's super dry and it's just ridiculous, then you can feel free to add a little bit of water. So you can see here, after 5 minutes or so of mixing, there's your dough. Had we done it by hand, we would have, as soon as the dough was starting to come together in the bowl, we would have started kneading it like this. So essentially turning, pressing it down, turn it 90 degrees, down with the heel of your hand, down like that. And that's how we're doing that. All right, so there's this dough. So I'm going to set this dough aside. In here, if we had made this for pita dough, we'd put it either in there or in a container, a clear plastic container where there's no friction and it can rise. And then just set that aside for about an hour and a half. Again, if you can put it in a spot where it's warmer, where it's closer to 70 degrees, or 75 degrees, that's going to be better. If it's 55 or 60 somewhere in your kitchen, it's not gonna do nearly as well. First, we're going to take the dough. This is the dough that I made at 9 a.m. this morning. I had it on the stove. It's a little cool, so it would heat up. So I'm going to dump that out on the counter. We're going to divide the dough into chunks that are about 115 grams each.
115 or
115. And I've got the scale here. 124. So this is roughly 115. You'll get a feel for how much. So a ball about, I don't know, 1.5 inches, 2 inches, 1.5 inches in size. So what you want to do is shape all of these into balls of about that size, and they really don't have to be exact. First, I'm going to just cut the pieces, and then I'll shape them in a minute.
You can find.
Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make these into balls. Sorry, you can do it as simply as taking it, folding it over itself to make a smooth ball like that. Doing that, you can do it that way, kind of folding it under, or you can do this fancy thing where you kind of create a little net with your hand and roll it, and you're kind of using the counter without any flour on it, notice, to pull it into more of a solid, a round ball. And what you want is you want that skin on top, ideally, to be fairly smooth, however you get there. And then we're going to let those sit. We're going to cover them over and let them sit for a while. Ideally, we want them to sit about half an hour, but if you're in a rush, otherwise you can probably get by doing it sooner. And if they sit, you don't want them to sit like 2 hours or something, that'll overproof. But so I'm going to cover those over with a towel just so they don't dry out. Hopefully they won't be in the way. So at this point, again, I've heated my oven to 500 degrees, and in that oven I have a pizza stone, basically, so we'll see that in a minute. I'm going to prepare my paddle, which is really great, and you can sort of, the goal here is going to be, you could put these on parchment paper, and normally when I make pizza or something else, I'll use parchment paper. I'll put cornmeal on the parchment paper and slide it out, or sourdough bread. But you could, in the case of pita, we use enough flour that we can, have the pita sort of slide off of there onto the stone. If you're using a cast iron pan or something like that, you may need a sort of different system. So unlike with other kinds of bread where you really, really, really try to not use more flour than you need, with this, you have more, there's not as much of a risk about using too much flour. You still could, but, and so basically I'm going to start by trying to make it into a nice circle and pat it out as long as I'm in it. All right, so you can see there, what I'm doing is rolling it out gradually. One of the most important things here is that you want it to be the same thickness. Because what's going to happen is, you'll see in the oven, you're going to put the bread on the hot stone, and the heat of the stone mainly is going to heat this whole thing up. Obviously there's water in there. It's going to create steam, and the two pieces of the dough are going to separate and create the pocket in the pita. So that's where you can make it thick, you can make it thin, but you really want to make sure that it is fairly even. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to set it aside. These should be about 5 or 6 inches. If you want to make, on the pocket pita recipe, it says, I think there's a recipe if you want to make them a lot bigger for some reason, you can do those, and I think it's 170 grams. Again, it's quite forgiving. So you can see the flecks of wheat flour in there. This makes it a little nicer and more interesting. All right, so then what we're going to do is we're going to put 2 of these onto here. Maybe I could do 4. And notice that I'm gonna, so you'll get ready with moving that camera. So you can see how I put them on here, and I want to make sure, and same thing if you were making pizza, you want to make sure that if you're moving it back and forth, that these aren't going to get stuck on the peel that you're using. You can also use a rimless cookie sheet for this, or maybe some other contraption, but you want something where you can just slide it out. So what we're going to do is we're going to go in the oven and go like that, and they're going to hopefully land on the stone and be baking there. We want to, these things are going to cook for a very short amount of time, really like 4 minutes, maybe another minute on the other side. So we want to get all 4 of the breads in pretty much at the same time. I am ready. So get the chips. So if you put it. All right. Here's our stove. All right. So you can see I've got the stone in there. I'm going to go to the back. Slide them in like that. That's 2. This cookbook, or maybe some cookbook, again, I'm going to make sure they're sliding. Get them in. You can probably fit 600. This cookbook talks.
Can you open it for a second?
Oh, sure. I'd love to. So there they are. One thing the cookbook suggests is that you can actually put the oven on broil. If you think about this, is very old bread that would be cooked by people just by putting it on a stone and a fire. And so it's really relying upon the heat from the stone to cook. So even if I leave this open now, I think we're fine. What you can see happening is that as the water is boiling inside there, the bread is rising. The center of the bread is the steam has nowhere to go but up, so it's rising there. You can see the one in the back. That is Pita. Oh, it popped. The one in the back just popped. Sometimes they won't separate for whatever reason. So we're going to cook them basically for about 4 minutes. Some recipes say you want to turn them over and cook them for a minute on the other side. And it's a little bit trial and error, but really just about 4 minutes. If you go much farther, then they start to get kind of hard. And let's see what happens with these front ones. It's possible one of them is going to get sort of stuck in the middle. There it goes. Ooh. And now it's ready for a falafel. Okay, you can. All right, so you can see those. You can see they're a little bit brown. I'm going to let them go. I, of course,
They look almost done.
Yeah, they did. I forgot to put the timer on. Let's sort of take those out and see how they are. I think they may want to go for a little bit longer, but let's take a look. I can slide it in.
Does bread cook for a little bit more after it comes out on its own?
Some breads do. This one not as much. So you can see these here. That one's the one that popped. Basically, you got to be real careful, which I just wasn't.
They have a lot of steam.
Because there's all that steam, the boiled water in there, and you want to be careful with that. If I flip them over, you can see that it's starting to brown on the bottom, and that's the part where you're going to want to make sure you don't kind of overdo it. It doesn't get too crispy. I think what I'll do with all of these is flip them over and just try to cook them for another minute so that the tops are done, and then we'll go from there. Make sure that you take all of the pieces out of the oven. A while ago, I discovered a bagel that I had left baking for 3 weeks in the back of the oven. It was not a pretty thing. So let's just see what's happening with these. So you can see they're not really going to rise anymore. They might go down a little bit. But I think now we're at about a minute. I'll take those out. What you might want to prepare, which again, it's really good if you can get all of them in. Should probably be wearing a mitt, but I'm not. It's really good if you can get all of them in at the same time. Yeah. If you can get all of them in at the same time, because then you don't have to deal with sort of moving things around in the oven. All right, there they are.
Need a basket.
I mean, I could put them on a cooling rack, but what I find is I'll just put them in a basket like this, line them up, not cover them, make sure that they've got room to breathe.
Okay. So you've got some questions.
Yes. There they are.
So can you? So somebody asked about seeing. Oops. I have to go to be able to see how brown. So it's just light flecks of brown.
That's on the bottom, yeah.
Yeah. So it's still pretty light.
And then on this side, that's the top. And again, you can see maybe because of the sugar, maybe because of how we cooked it on that side for a little bit, you're definitely getting some brown. Let's cut it open and see. All right. So now you can look inside and you can see you've got a pocket there. That would be good enough to hold falafel, sort of. One side is a lot thicker than the other, so it's just sort of, you know. But it's fine. You can see how the gluten sort of stretched out there as it cooked and as it rose.
I see people eating. Are you eating your pita or something else?
I am.
Yeah. I mean, you
I have to try it.
pull a little bit, but it's pretty. I mean, this is a bread you want to eat fresh, really fresh. I'll make these and I'll give some away and freeze a bunch of them. One of the key things, as you could tell, the whole secret there, I mean, I had that oven open the whole time almost. One of the key things was that stone was super hot, right? It had been heating for almost an hour. So I think that's the key thing. If you have a cookie sheet is not going to get as hot as that stone. So it'll be more difficult, but really, like, you got to have a surface that is going to be hot enough to do most of the cooking.